June 17, 1944, at Saipan. The island trembles beneath a curtain of flame and ash. Black volcanic sand clings to the boots of U.S. Marines as they crawl forward under a sky the color of gunmetal. Palm trunks lie shattered. The air reeks of salt, smoke, and burning oil. For 3 days, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had been pinned down. Japanese bunkers, cut deep into coral ridges, spat machine gun fire so dense it sliced through palm leaves like razors. Every assault had failed. Men fell, flame tanks burned, and progress stalled at the base of a hill the Marines had come to call Hell's Pocket. Then came the order. A new team would advance, armed not with rifles but with flamethrowers. Steel cylinders on their backs, hoses coiled like serpents, they moved through the smoke in silence. Their mission? Clear 10 fortified bunkers in 6 hours, or die trying. As the first ignition hissed, a wall of fire burst across the hillside, liquid flame rolling into the bunkers, sucking the air out of the tunnels below. For the first time that week, the Japanese guns went silent. The Battle of Saipan was not just another clash in the Pacific, it was the doorway to Japan's heart. By mid-1944, the United States had clawed its way across the ocean island by island from Guadalcanal to the Marshalls. Each step brought them closer to the Japanese homeland, but none carried the weight of Saipan. Located in the northern Marianas, Saipan was a dagger pointed directly at Tokyo, only 300 miles away. From there, the new American B-29 superfortresses could strike the Japanese mainland for the first time. Washington knew that if Saipan fell, Japan's fate would be sealed. Tokyo knew it too. That's why the island was turned into a fortress. 30,000 Japanese soldiers entrenched in a network of caves, pillboxes, and underground tunnels awaited the inevitable assault. They were commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a stern officer who had sworn to make Saipan the graveyard of the American fleet. When the U.S. Navy began its bombardment on June 13, 1944, the island vanished beneath an ocean of fire. 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, and nearly 30 destroyers poured over 165,000 shells onto the island. The bombardment was so fierce that entire hillsides collapsed. Yet when the Marines landed, Japanese guns opened up from positions that had survived untouched. Machine guns raked the beaches. Mortars landed in tight, lethal arcs. By the end of the first day, the Marines had carved out only a shallow beachhead, a few thousand yards deep, littered with burning Amtraks and bodies. The battle had barely begun, and already Saipan had claimed over 2,000 American lives, but it was what came next that would define the fight for Saipan. The Marines quickly realized they weren't fighting a conventional army. The Japanese defenders had transformed the island itself into a weapon, using coral ridges, jungle undergrowth, and even sugarcane fields as part of a vast defense system. Every inch of terrain was connected by tunnels. A bunker destroyed in the morning could erupt back to life by afternoon. The American assault tactics, designed for open beach fighting, were failing in the dense interior. This was no longer a battle of maneuver but of extermination. And that's when the flamethrower teams entered the story. Born out of desperation and innovation, these units were a direct response to Japan's method of warfare. The enemy refused to surrender. They fought from holes, caves, and crevices where rifles and grenades couldn't reach. The only weapon that could clear them was fire. By 1944, the M2A17 flamethrower had become standard issue for U.S. Marine assault engineers. It could project a stream of burning napalm up to 50 yards, a weapon as terrifying as it was effective. But it came at a price. A single hit to the fuel tank could turn its operator into a human torch. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower man in battle was measured in minutes, not hours. Still, they volunteered. Because every Marine knew, if the bunkers weren't cleared, no one advanced. By June 16th, the American front had stalled at the approaches to Mount Tapochau, the island's high ground and the key to the entire campaign. From its slopes, Japanese artillery spotted and struck every movement below. The 4th Marine Division was bleeding in place. The only way forward was through a maze of fortified positions nicknamed Death Valley, and within that valley sat 10 interlocking bunkers. 10 strong points that had already chewed up 2 battalions. Commanders gathered in silence under a makeshift canopy that night. Maps were spread out, sand mixed with blood and rain. If those bunkers held another day, the entire offensive could unravel. There was one option left: the flamethrower teams. Backed by Sherman tanks modified with Ronson flamethrowers, they would advance before dawn. The mission: clear the bunkers, secure the ridge, and open the path to Mount Tapachau, no matter the cost. The men who strapped those steel tanks onto their backs the next morning weren't thinking of glory. They were thinking of the weight of gasoline pressing against their spines, the heat of the Pacific sun, and the smell of death carried on the wind, because they knew what lay ahead, and they went anyway. The men chosen for the flamethrower teams were not ordinary Marines. They were handpicked from assault engineer units, men trained to handle demolitions, explosives, and close-quarters combat. But nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of wielding a weapon that turned them into both predator and target. Their weapon, the M2A17 flamethrower, was brutal in its simplicity. A steel tank strapped to the operator's back held about 5 gallons of thickened fuel, connected to a wand-like projector. When ignited, it could spew a jet of liquid fire up to 45 yards, reaching into the caves and bunkers that resisted everything else. The Marines learned to use it in short, terrifying bursts. 1 second of flame could engulf an entire cave entrance. But the weight was crushing. Nearly 70 pounds when filled, heavy enough to slow even the strongest man. And when the enemy saw the distinct shape of the twin tanks on their backs, they fired at it with everything they had. There was no illusion about survival. A flamethrower operator's job was to get close, within 20 to 30 yards, and burn whatever hid inside the darkness. It wasn't just a task. It was a death sentence wrapped in discipline. At Saipan, this task became the backbone of progress. Japanese defenses were layered, interconnected, and brutally efficient. Each pillbox covered the next. Caves were dug so deep that even direct hits from 75mm shells couldn't reach the defenders inside. The Japanese soldiers would wait in silence until Marines walked past, then emerge from hidden exits to attack from behind. To fight this kind of enemy, fire became the only language that worked. Marine engineers practiced coordination with Sherman tanks fitted with the new E45 Ronson flamethrower system. Named for the famous lighter that always lights the first time, these tanks could project jets of flame over 100 yards. Together with the infantry flamethrower units, they became a synchronized inferno of destruction. The tactic was brutal but methodical. First, a tank would advance slowly, unleashing flame into a suspected bunker. The Marines followed close behind, sweeping for any survivors or alternate exits. Then came the assault engineers, clearing obstacles and securing the ground before the next advance. In the humid jungles of Saipan, the combination of gasoline, heat, and fear created an unbearable environment. The air was filled with the smell of scorched vegetation and burning concrete. The earth itself seemed to smoke. Yet the Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. Many preferred suicide over capture, using grenades inside their own bunkers. Each battle was measured not in yards gained, but in bunkers destroyed. Reports described the daily rhythm: advance 50 yards, encounter fire, call flamethrower team, burn position, move forward. The Marines were turning the island's fortifications into ash, one cave at a time. Behind these tactical maneuvers, there was a deeper psychological war at play. For the Japanese, flame was the most feared weapon of all. It violated every code of the warrior spirit. To be burned alive rather than die by the sword or bullet was seen as dishonor beyond comprehension. Some Japanese soldiers, realizing they were trapped, would charge into open fire rather than face the flame. Others, hidden deep underground, screamed prayers as they were consumed, and yet the flamethrower men carried their burden in silence. They did not revel in it. They did not boast. Many later confessed that the weapon haunted them long after the war. The image of what it did, the smell of what was left behind. But in that moment at Saipan, there was no room for hesitation. The U.S. forces needed to break through to Mount Tapachau. Every inch forward meant fewer men dying in the valley below. The flamethrower crews became the unsung backbone of the advance, crawling forward under machine gun fire, igniting the darkness bunker by bunker. By June 20th, American lines were closing around the central heights of Saipan. The Japanese defense was fracturing but far from finished. In the north, thousands of enemy soldiers regrouped for one final stand. In the south, isolated units continued fighting from caves, forcing the Marines into deadly close-quarters combat. That day, 10 heavily fortified bunkers, stood between the 2nd Marine Division and the road to Tapachau's summit. The same bunkers that had repelled repeated assaults, and the same ones now targeted for destruction by the flamethrower teams. The stage was set for one of the most ferocious and unforgettable displays of raw firepower in the Pacific. War. The psychological toll on flamethrower operators, the tactical genius behind their use, the Japanese defender's mindset, and the technological evolution of flame warfare. The flamethrower operators of Saipan were not chosen for cruelty. They were chosen for courage. Most were volunteers from engineer or demolition units, men who had already proven calm under fire. But carrying a weapon that made you both executioner and target was something no training manual could prepare them for. Private Robert Sledge, one such operator, later recalled that the sound of the fuel igniting was like hell's breath opening behind your back. The roar was deafening, the heat unbearable. Every squeeze of the trigger was a conscious decision, one that burned through not just the jungle, but a man's own conscience. They often worked in pairs. One man carried the M2 on his back, another covered him with a rifle or bar. The moment the flame erupted, every Japanese soldier within sight focused fire on the tank. One bullet could ignite the operator in a flash, though in truth the fuel was too viscous to explode easily. Still, that didn't stop the fear. The operators knew. Once seen, they had seconds to act or die. Marines who fought beside them described these men as ghosts after battle, silent, distant, their faces blackened by soot. Some carried the smell of burned fuel in their gear for weeks. In letters home, few mentioned what they had done. There was pride in surviving, but shame in remembering. Yet without them, the American advance on Saipan would have stalled. The riflemen, the tankers, the artillery, all depended on the flamethrowers to silence what bullets and shells could not. These men carried the fire of progress, even when it burned their souls along the way. In the Pacific, tactics were dictated by terrain, and Saipan was a fortress of coral, caves, and jungle. Japanese engineers had spent months shaping the landscape into a web of interlocking defenses. Every position had overlapping fields of fire, and every bunker connected to escape tunnels leading to secondary strongholds. Traditional assaults had proven suicidal. Grenades and small arms couldn't reach defenders behind thick walls. Mortars and naval guns only sealed entrances, allowing soldiers inside to emerge again once the barrage ended. The solution came not from brute force, but from chemistry, fire that could seep, crawl, and consume where shrapnel could not. Marine commanders developed a grimly efficient system. Tanks with Ronson flamethrowers advanced first, sweeping broad arcs of fire to suppress hidden positions. Behind them, engineer teams with portable flamethrowers moved up under cover, targeting cave mouths or bunkers the tanks couldn't reach. Infantry squads followed immediately to finish clearing and secure the area. Each step required coordination under intense fire. Communication was by hand signals and shouted commands over the roar of burning fuel. The timing had to be exact. Too soon and men would burn their own cover. Too late and enemy gunners would cut them down. Flame tactics were not random violence. They were precision tools of siege warfare. Once fire entered a bunker, it consumed oxygen, turned confined air into choking fumes, and forced even the most disciplined soldiers out, straight into waiting rifles. In that sense, fire didn't just destroy the enemy's position, it destroyed his will. The success of these tactics at Saipan reshaped Marine doctrine for the rest of the Pacific campaign. From Tinian to Iwo Jima, flame teams became integral to every assault plan. Fire had become a weapon of both destruction and message, a visible symbol that no defense, however deep, could hide from American determination. The M2 flamethrower was an evolution of early, unreliable designs tested during the 1930s. Engineers at the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service had studied German and British flamethrowers from World War I, aiming to create something lighter, safer, and more consistent. By the time of Saipan, the M2A17 model was the best the Allies had. It featured twin tanks, one for fuel, one for pressurized nitrogen, and a trigger-mounted ignition system powered by small cartridges. The stream of fire lasted only a few seconds, but that was enough to clear most positions. Still, it was far from perfect. If the operator fell, the tanks could leak and a stray tracer could ignite the spillage. The range was short compared to Japanese heavy machine guns, forcing operators to expose themselves in deadly proximity. But its psychological power outweighed its flaws. When the first burst of flame cut through the air, entire enemy squads often broke formation or abandoned their posts. Tank-mounted flamethrowers were another leap forward. The M4 Sherman-Ronson models could sustain fire bursts lasting over a minute, projecting jets up to 150 yards. They turned entire cave systems into roaring furnaces, melting steel and coral alike. Japanese intelligence noted this shift with alarm. Reports to Tokyo described these weapons as unstoppable waves of fire, advising garrisons to dig deeper, hide vents, or construct flame-resistant barriers. But in practice, there was no real defense, only delay. The weapons used on Saipan laid the groundwork for the next generation of flame systems, including those mounted on LVT amphibious vehicles and the legendary CBH-1 flamethrower tank used at Okinawa. Technology was evolving not just to kill, but to dominate psychologically, a sign of how warfare was turning from bullets and shells to sheer elemental terror. The fire of Saipan was more than a tool. It was a symbol of total war's transformation. Yet behind every burst of flame were men, tactics, and machines working in dreadful harmony. And at the heart of it all, a desperate enemy who refused to yield, even as the world around them turned to ash. From within the labyrinth of caves and bunkers, the Japanese soldiers saw the battle in a very different light. They were not simply defending land. They were defending the Emperor's honor, the spirit of Japan itself. Surrender was not an option. Death in fire was preferable to life in shame. For them, the American flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a vision of hell. Reports recovered after the battle described the horror vividly. The fire flowed like liquid into the cave. There was no escape. The walls turned red and the air vanished. Flames snaked through vents and gun ports, consuming oxygen in seconds. Even those who survived the first blast suffocated or burned alive in the superheated air that followed. Inside the bunkers, soldiers sometimes placed grenades to their chests or leaped from their hiding places into the fire rather than face capture. The American assault was terrifyingly methodical. Each position eliminated one by one, leaving no illusion of hope. Some Japanese officers, understanding the hopelessness, urged their men to make banzai charges, the final desperate rush of suicidal bravery. They believed that dying in combat, and even against tanks and fire, restored dignity denied by defeat. To the Americans outside, these charges looked like madness. To the Japanese inside, they were the last expression of faith and honor. By June 1944, word spread across the island that no reinforcements were coming. Saipan's garrison commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, delivered his final order. "I will advance with those who remain to the place where the enemy line is. I will die there." The next morning, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians launched one of the largest mass suicide attacks of the Pacific War, a wave that crashed against American machine guns and flamethrowers alike. In that moment, the fire of Saipan ceased to be a tactic. It became a tragedy, the end of a garrison, the burning of an ideal. War tests not only nations but the souls of men. The use of flamethrowers, weapons that burned soldiers alive, raised deep moral questions even among the victors. American commanders justified the weapon as a military necessity. Every Japanese bunker represented dozens of potential American casualties if taken by conventional assault. In the dense tunnel-filled terrain, fire was the only reliable method of neutralizing the enemy without losing entire platoons. Yet many Marines who fought at Saipan later admitted to moral unease. Lieutenant Earl Cook of the 2nd Marine Division recalled, "We told ourselves it was war and that it saved lives. But when the flames went out and the silence came, you started to wonder if you'd burned men or monsters." The line between necessity and cruelty blurred in the smoke. Journalists who arrived after the fighting found charred caves filled with bodies, blackened beyond recognition. Some correspondents refused to publish the photos, fearing public backlash at home. In Washington, officials viewed the weapon as an unfortunate but effective tool. The Pacific War was one of annihilation, island by island, fortress by fortress, and the moral landscape burned with the same intensity as the battlefields. Even today, historians debate whether flame warfare was justified, But on Saipan, for those 6 relentless hours when 10 bunkers fell to fire, there was no room for philosophy. Only survival. The Marines who used the weapon did so because no other weapon worked. And when the island fell, many of them discarded their flamethrowers, not out of tactical need, but because they could no longer bear to carry them. Fire doesn't just destroy, it consumes courage. That was its real purpose in the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders were famously resilient, often fighting to the last man, sometimes even after being mortally wounded. But even they could not withstand the terror of flame. When a flamethrower ignited, its sound echoed like a jet of thunder through the hills. The light turned night into day. Soldiers hiding in the dark suddenly saw their own shadows against burning rock. Flames crawled through cracks, rolled across the ground, and licked the ceilings of bunkers. No one could predict where it would go next. This unpredictability, the sense that fire itself was hunting you, broke even the toughest defenders. Many Japanese soldiers abandoned well-fortified positions after the first encounter, retreating deeper into caves or into suicidal charges simply to escape the psychological torture. For the Americans, too, the weapon had a psychological toll. Flamethrower operators became symbols of dread, to the enemy and to their own comrades. Some Marines avoided sleeping near them, calling them marked men. And after the fighting, many operators were haunted by nightmares. Some reported hearing the screams of burning soldiers in their dreams decades later. Psychiatrists studying combat trauma after the war found that flamethrower operators exhibited some of the highest rates of post-war guilt and anxiety, more than machine gunners, more than tank crews. The weapon may have won battles, but it left invisible scars. In the end, both sides were consumed, one by fire, the other by memory. The battle for Saipan showed the world the extremes of modern warfare, where technology, strategy, and human will collided in terrifying unity. Yet the story was not over. The island was secured, but at an unimaginable cost, and its fall would set into motion one of the most decisive shifts in the entire Pacific campaign. June 16, 1944, the third week of the battle for Saipan. The morning heat was already unbearable, but what the island was about to experience would redefine the meaning of fire. Hill 500, a rocky rise overlooking the southern coast, had become one of the most fortified Japanese positions on the island. From its maze of tunnels, pillboxes, and camouflaged artillery nests, Japanese troops could command nearly all southern approaches. For the U.S. Marines of the 8th Regiment, it was a deadly choke point that halted every advance. For 3 days, American tanks, artillery, and airstrikes had bombarded the hill, yet when the smoke cleared, Japanese guns still roared back. No one could reach the top until the order came: bring the flamethrowers. The Marines moved in before dawn. In the gray light, the island looked like the surface of another planet, cratered, burning, and eerily silent except for the whine of distant engines. A platoon of Sherman tanks equipped with E-45 portable flamethrowers and POA CWS H-1 flame tanks rolled forward behind infantry. The tanks bore black scorch marks from previous battles. Their operators knew what awaited them, the same invisible bunkers that had swallowed dozens of men in earlier attempts. At 0600 hours, the assault began. The first flame tank, nicknamed Hot Stuff, fired a stream of burning fuel more than 70 yards long. The flame curved through the air like a liquid spear, striking a bunker's gun port with surgical precision. Inside, heat and pressure built instantly. Ammunition cooked off. Grenades detonated. Screams pierced the chaos. Marines advanced, tossing satchel charges and grenades into openings as fire consumed everything within. Each explosion was followed by silence, the chilling confirmation that the bunker was gone. Japanese machine guns erupted from higher up the slope, cutting through the infantry line. The Marines dove into shell holes as tracer fire zipped overhead. Then another flame tank turned its turret. One burst, and the hillside itself seemed to ignite. The flames crawled across the rocks, leaving black smoke and silence. For the next 6 hours, the battle became a grim rhythm. Locate, burn, clear, move. 10 bunkers in total, each one fortified with steel doors, sandbags, and overlapping fields of fire, fell in succession. By noon, the once impregnable hill had turned into a smoking ruin. At the summit, Marines found the shattered remnants of a Japanese command post. Inside lay maps, water containers, and personal letters, some half-burned, others untouched. One note read simply, Tell my wife the island still stands. It didn't. Hill 500's fall broke the southern defense of Saipan. With it, the entire Japanese line began to unravel. Communication between bunkers collapsed, and surviving defenders retreated into caves deeper inland. Yet, even in victory, the Marines felt no triumph. They stood in silence, watching smoke rise from the hill, the same smoke that had once shielded their enemies. The air smelled of fuel, ash, and something far heavier, the scent of what total war meant. One Marine later wrote in his journal, "We took the hill." But no one cheered. Not one. The battle had shown them the full power of their weapons, and the human cost behind that power. But Saipan was not yet over. The next confrontation would bring something even greater. The final Japanese counterattack, when thousands of men, wounded and starving, would charge the American line in one last desperate act of defiance. June 17, 1944. The night before dawn on Saipan was deathly still. The humid air carried the faint crackle of distant fires and the murmuring of waves crashing against coral shores. But deep within the ravines east of Hill 500, thousands of Japanese soldiers were gathering for one final act, an assault that would go down as one of the largest banzai charges in World War II. After the collapse of their southern defense, Japanese command on the island was shattered. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, trapped in his underground headquarters, knew the battle was lost. Supplies were gone. Communication lines had been cut. His men, once 30,000 strong, were now a few thousand, many wounded, many without weapons. Yet surrender was unthinkable. To the Japanese soldier, capture meant dishonor worse than death. So Saito ordered one last charge. Not to win, but to die fighting. At 8:04:45 hours, as the horizon began to lighten, the silence broke. From the jungle, a deep, thunderous roar erupted. Thousands of voices screaming, "Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" Then came the surge. 3,000 men rushed down from the hills. Infantry, officers, medics, even wounded men with bandaged heads and broken arms. Some carried rifles, others only bayonets, swords, or sticks. They charged straight into the American lines near the 105th Infantry Regiment. The first wave hit like a hurricane. Machine guns opened up instantly. 30 caliber and 50 caliber fire cutting through the mass of charging soldiers. Yet still they came. They clambered over barbed wire, climbed over their own fallen comrades, shouting, screaming, firing wildly. The American front line buckled. For a moment it seemed like the Japanese might break through. Flamethrower teams rushed forward, aiming at the densest clusters of attackers. Streams of burning fuel turned the darkness into day. Entire sections of the charge vanished in fire, but the momentum didn't stop. Japanese soldiers who survived the flames threw themselves into foxholes, stabbing, clawing, and firing at point-blank range. By sunrise, the battlefield had become a nightmare, a landscape of smoke, screams and fire. Marines fought hand-to-hand. Some resorted to entrenching tools and rifle butts when ammunition ran out. A handful of Sherman flame tanks turned their turrets toward the hills and unleashed the last of their fuel. Every burst of fire lit up the terrain, and with it the end of organized resistance on Saipan. By 09:30 hours, it was over. The final banzai charge had been annihilated. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead across a mile of terrain, bodies piled over wrecked bunkers, scattered along the ridges and roadsides. The Americans lost nearly 650 men that morning, one of the heaviest single-day casualties in the Pacific Campaign. But the Japanese army on Saipan had ceased to exist. When word reached the remaining command bunker, General Saito, mortally wounded and knowing the island had fallen, committed ritual suicide beside his chief of staff. The Imperial flag was burned rather than captured. At the same time, U.S. Marines stood silently among the ruins of the battlefield. They were exhausted, blackened with soot, their uniforms scorched. The ground was still smoking from the flamethrowers' work. In the distance, the sound of sporadic gunfire echoed. Isolated pockets of Japanese soldiers refusing to surrender even after their world had collapsed. The Battle of Saipan was ending, but the Pacific War had entered a darker phase. Because what America learned here about fire, psychology, and human endurance would soon be applied on a scale the world had never seen. Next came the reckoning, the aftermath of Saipan, an island drowned in fire. haunted by loss and forever changed by what it revealed about both sides of the war. When the last shot faded across Saipan, the island fell eerily quiet. The smoke still drifted from the charred jungles. The coral hills, once fortified by thousands of defenders, were now black scars under the Pacific sun. Everywhere, the scent of salt and fire mingled with death. The Battle of Saipan, from June 15 to July 9, 1944, had lasted 25 days. It ended with an American victory that shook the foundations of the Japanese Empire. But victory came at a staggering cost. Nearly 400 Americans were killed and over 10,000 wounded. The Japanese losses were catastrophic, around 30,000 soldiers dead, and only 921 taken prisoner. It was not just defeat, it was annihilation. For Japan, Saipan was more than just a lost island. It was the gateway to their homeland. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly from captured airfields. When Tokyo heard the news, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed within days. It marked the beginning of Japan's political unraveling. But on the ground, in those weeks after the battle, the human cost was almost unbearable to witness. Thousands of Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, had been caught in the crossfire. Many hid in caves or along the cliffs near Marpi Point, terrified by years of propaganda that told them Americans would torture or kill them. Tragically, hundreds took their own lives rather than surrender. American soldiers, realizing what was happening, tried desperately to stop them, shouting assurances in Japanese, sending interpreters forward, even holding out food and water. But the fear was too deep. The cliffs of northern Saipan became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, names that would remain etched in military memory. For the Americans, these scenes left a haunting impression. They had come to the island to fight soldiers, not civilians. The shock of seeing mothers leap with their children from the cliffs was something many Marines never forgot. It changed how the U.S. military would plan future invasions, knowing that every Japanese-held island would not only be a fortress, but a psychological battlefield. In the weeks that followed, the U.S. began transforming Saipan into a massive forward base. Runways were extended. Airfields were constructed from the ruins of battle. And within 2 months, B-29 super fortresses were taking off from those same runways, loaded with bombs bound for Tokyo. The battle had revealed something else too, the power of new technology, particularly the flamethrower. Reports from Saipan reached Washington and the War Department's engineering divisions. Commanders described it as the most effective weapon for neutralizing Japanese fortifications, especially in caves and bunkers. One Marine wrote bluntly in his report, "Bullets couldn't touch them. Fire did." From that point onward, American engineers refined the M2 flamethrower design, improving its range and reliability. By the time of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, flame tanks and portable units had become central to U.S. assault strategy. What began on Saipan, the ruthless efficiency of firepower against fanatic defense, and had become the new face of the Pacific War. And yet, amid that triumph of tactics and machinery, something more profound was unfolding, a reckoning with the limits of human endurance. The Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man. The Americans had been forced to destroy them completely. The moral weight of that realization would follow both nations long after the guns went silent. The battle for Saipan had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to burn their way through the world's conscience. In the months following the conquest of Saipan, the island was transformed from a battlefield into a fortress of its own, this time under American control. What had once been Japanese soil became the forward edge of America's Pacific strategy. Massive engineering units from the U.S. Navy Seabees arrived almost immediately. They leveled shattered villages, cleared wrecked tanks, and bulldozed runways across what was left of the sugar plantations. The island soon bristled with fuel depots, radar stations, and concrete bunkers, but now they bore American flags. By November 1944, B-29 bombers were rolling down the runways of Isley Field, carrying thousands of pounds of explosives toward Japan. From Saipan's skies, Tokyo was less than 2,500 miles away. The same island that had seen 10 Japanese bunkers erased by flamethrowers now became the launch point for the destruction of entire cities. For Japan, this was the nightmare come true. The impregnable outer ring of their Pacific defenses had been breached, and the Emperor's military advisors knew it. The loss of Saipan meant that no ocean or fortress could stop America's advance any longer. When the first waves of B-29s began crossing the Pacific, Japanese citizens heard the air raid sirens for the first time. It was a new kind of war, impersonal, distant, and devastating. What began as a battle for a single island had shifted the entire balance of the conflict. But amid this larger military triumph, the soldiers who had survived Saipan carried home a more personal story, one of exhaustion, disbelief, and quiet reflection. In letters sent back to families, Marines and soldiers wrote of the enemy's stubborn courage and the horrors they had witnessed in the caves. Many admitted they no longer saw the Japanese as faceless villains. They saw them as men, determined, desperate, and doomed. Some even expressed sorrow at the civilians who had perished needlessly. For every bunker burned by a flamethrower, there was a story of fear on both sides of the nozzle. The Americans feared the ambushes. The Japanese feared surrender. Both sides believed they were fighting for survival. Yet in the end, Saipan became more than a victory. It was a mirror, showing the world what total war looked like when technology stripped away distance and mercy. The American flamethrower, the B-29 bomber, and the Japanese code of Bushido all collided here, in one island's brutal baptism of fire. By early 1945, the lessons of Saipan guided U.S. commanders in every subsequent invasion. Flamethrower teams were assigned to every infantry company. Psychological warfare units prepared leaflets to encourage Japanese civilians to surrender peacefully, and naval bombardments grew heavier, longer, and more relentless before each landing. But perhaps the deepest legacy of Saipan was invisible, the psychological one. For Japan, it marked the moment their invincibility cracked. For America, it revealed the grim price of victory in the Pacific, a price that would only grow as they moved closer to Japan itself. When the war finally reached its end in 1945, and American troops began occupying the Japanese homeland, some officers reflected back to Saipan. It was there that they first saw an entire enemy society willing to die rather than yield. It was there they learned that defeating Japan would not simply be a military act. It would be an act of erasing a belief system. Saipan's fields, once alive with fire, slowly returned to silence. The jungle regrew over the burned bunkers. The coral cliffs stood unchanged, indifferent to the human tragedy that had unfolded below them. And yet buried beneath the soil were the remnants of both empires, the rusted tanks, the shattered helmets, the unspoken memories of men who had faced each other across the inferno. The Battle of Saipan ended the myth of Japan's unbreakable empire and marked the moment when America's technological might, its fire and steel, began to reshape the Pacific forever. The island still stands today, quiet and green, but the echoes of that fire never fully faded. The Battle of Saipan was more than a conquest of land. It was a confrontation between two visions of war. One was ancient, the Japanese belief that honor was found in death. The other was modern, the American conviction that technology could overcome any obstacle. Between them burned the flamethrower, a symbol of the new, merciless century. Its roar echoed the transformation of warfare itself, from face-to-face courage to mechanical destruction. In those tunnels and bunkers, humanity met the machine, and the machine won. But victory came at a cost that could never be measured only in miles or maps. For every bunker burned, a piece of human conscience was scorched too. The men who held the flamethrowers remembered the smell, the sound, the sudden silence after fire. And they carried those memories long after the war ended. For Japan, Saipan became the beginning of the end, the point where faith in the empire turned to dread. For America, it was the threshold of overwhelming power, and the warning that such power could one day consume its own soul. When the flames died out, and the bombers rose from Saipan's new airfields, the world had changed forever. The battle that had lasted only weeks became a symbol of the Pacific War's entire truth, that courage and conviction mean little when confronted by industrial fire. Yet even within that destruction, there remained moments of mercy. Marines giving water to captured soldiers, medics pulling children from caves, chaplains saying prayers over both flags. It was there, in the ashes, that humanity flickered again. Saipan's story is not just about who won or lost. It is about how far humanity went and how close it came to losing itself in pursuit of victory. Today, when the ocean winds move across the cliffs of Marpy Point, they whisper through the bones of two nations that once clashed there. The fire has long gone cold, but its lesson endures. That even in the most terrible wars, it is not power that defines us, but what we choose to remember when the smoke clears. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.